Marcus Whitfield was 39 years old, and for 11 years he had carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove. He drove a 2014 Silverado with a dent in the tailgate he never bothered to fix. He wore boots that had been resoled twice. Her family called him Steady Marcus, and her sister called him the Help, and Vivienne never corrected either of them. He had walked into the Beaumont family compound in Buckhead that Sunday afternoon expecting another performative dinner, where her father would ask about his little construction thing, and her brother would refill his own glass twice for every once he refilled Marcus's. Instead, he walked into a celebration. Balloons, a cake from the bakery on Peachtree that cost more than most people's groceries. His wife at the head of the table in a dress he had never seen, laughing, raising a champagne flute, and her mother, Lenora, standing beside her, saying the words out loud to a room of 40 people. To my daughter's fresh start. To finally being free of dead weight. The dead weight was him. He stood in the foyer holding a bottle of wine he had picked up on the way over and watched his wife of 11 years toast her own divorce 6 hours before she had bothered to tell him she had filed it. $1.4 million in liquid assets the Beaumonts believed they were about to strip from him in the settlement. $1.4 million they had spent 2 years quietly engineering through their family attorney. A forged signature on a refinance document, and a wife who had been sleeping in his bed while photographing his tax returns. What Vivienne never thought to ask, not in 11 years, not once, was where the working capital for her father's 3 Beaumont logistics warehouses had come from in 2019, when the family business nearly went under. What none of them knew was whose name sat behind the holding company that had quietly bought their debt. He set the bottle of wine down on the entry table. He did not announce himself. He turned and walked back to his truck. What happened next would cost the Beaumonts everything they thought they had built. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning before any of that, the light came through the kitchen window of the bungalow Marcus had bought in 2011, the year before he met Vivienne, in a quiet stretch of East Atlanta where the houses sat close and the porches still meant something. He stood at the counter in a gray t-shirt and work pants, pouring coffee into a chipped mug his grandmother had given him the summer he turned 16. The mug said Whitfield and Sons across the side in faded blue lettering, though there were no sons, only Marcus, and there had been no Whitfield business since his father had closed the cabinet shop in 1998 and gone to work for a contractor downtown. The kitchen tiles under his feet were ones he had laid himself, slate gray, set in a herringbone pattern his grandmother had drawn for him on a paper napkin the week before she died. She had told him once, sitting at her own kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup just like the one he held now, "Marcus, you don't tell people what you are. You let them find out. The ones who matter will look, the ones who don't never deserve to know." He had been 22 then. He had not understood. He understood now. The credenza in the dining room was one he had built the winter Vivienne, and he got engaged, walnut and brass, the kind of piece a man builds when he believes he is building towards something. He still ran his hand along its edge most mornings out of habit. His other phone, the one nobody at the Beaumont compound knew about, the one with the encrypted line to his attorney Felicia Green and his portfolio manager at the firm in Charlotte, stayed in the inner pocket of his work jacket where it had always been. He poured a second cup. He thought about the first time he had met Vivienne, at a charity build in Cabbagetown when he was 28, and she was a volunteer photographer in expensive jeans pretending she knew how to hold a hammer. She had laughed when he showed her how to start a nail. She had asked him to dinner that same week. She had been warm then, or what he had believed was warm. And for the first 3 years of their marriage, he had believed she did not care what he was worth, because she had never asked. He had been wrong about that. She had not asked because she had already assumed, and assumed wrongly, and her family had assumed alongside her. His phone buzzed on the counter. Not the inner pocket phone. The other one, the one his wife knew about. A text from Vivienne. "Family dinner at my parents' tonight. 6 o'clock. Try not to wear the boots." He read it twice. He set the phone face down on the counter. He noticed she had not signed it with anything. Not a heart, not a name, not the small X she used to add when she was 29 and still pretended to love him. He drank the rest of his coffee. He went to work. The site that day was a 40-unit development in Inman Park that Whitfield Build Group had broken ground on 6 months earlier. Marcus owned it, though the corporate filings listed a holding company called Crest Hill Holdings ALC. And Crest Hill Holdings was wholly owned by another entity in Delaware, and that entity was wholly owned by Marcus through a trust his attorney had structured in 2017. He walked the site that morning in his dented boots and his weathered Carhartt, and the framers called him Mr. Whitfield and the foreman handed him the day's punch list, and he signed it without ceremony. He spent the next 4 hours doing what he always did, walking framing, checking sight lines, kneeling to examine a transition between two flooring materials a subcontractor had cut poorly. He did not lose his temper. He marked it for redo. At noon, he sat in his truck eating a sandwich, and his attorney Felicia called. She did not call unless something needed his attention. "Marcus," she said, "I just had a phone call I want you to know about." A lawyer named Reginald Hattaway, out of a firm in Buckhead that mostly handles the Beaumont family business. He called to feel out whether you had separate counsel of your own. He was fishing. I told him I had no comment. But Marcus, I want you to understand what that call means. He listened. He understood. He thanked her. He hung up. He sat in the truck a long moment with his sandwich in his lap and looked at the framing of the building rising in front of him. He thought about his grandmother's words. He thought about the way Vivienne had stopped using the small X. He thought about the second mortgage paperwork he had glanced at 3 weeks earlier, the refinance documents she had told him to sign quickly before he left for a site visit, the way her hand had been a little too steady when she handed him the pen. He had signed them, or so she believed. He went home that evening and changed his shirt. He did not change his boots. He drove to the Beaumont compound on West Pace's ferry, a 3-acre property with a circular drive and a fountain her father had imported from somewhere in Italy and never stopped mentioning, and he saw the cars parked along the drive and the catering van at the side entrance, and he understood, before he ever walked inside, that the dinner Vivienne had texted him about was not a dinner. He walked in with a bottle of wine and heard the toast. He heard his mother-in-law, Lenora, say the words dead weight. He heard his wife laugh. He stood in the foyer for 40 seconds while no one noticed him, because no one in that house had ever truly noticed him, and then he turned around and walked back to his truck and drove home. He did not call Vivienne. He did not text her. He sat in his kitchen, on his herringbone tile, and he opened the laptop on his table, and he began to work. He pulled the refinance paperwork from his cloud drive. He pulled the original mortgage. He pulled the signature exemplar his attorney had filed with a notary 3 years earlier as a precaution, because Felicia had told him once that wealthy men in marriages should always have a verified signature on file in case of disputes, and he had thought she was being paranoid, and she had not been. The signature on the refinance document was a careful forgery. Close, but not his. He pulled bank statements. He pulled credit card records. He pulled the joint accounts and the household accounts and the discretionary fund Vivienne managed for what she called household enrichment. He cross-referenced 18 months of transactions. He found $84,000 transferred incrementally to an account in her sister Brianni's name. He found another $62,000 routed through a shell LLC her brother Pierce had registered in Florida. He found the law firm retainer paid in March of the previous year. 14 months. She had been planning it for 14 months while sleeping in his bed and asking him to take out the trash. His hands did not shake. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined every framing inspection and every site walk and every estimate he had ever written. He opened a new folder on his desktop and he named it simply Beaumont. Some things you did not say out loud. You documented them. He worked until 2 a.m. When he finally closed the laptop, he sat in the dark kitchen and he thought about the warehouses. The 3 Beaumont Logistics warehouses in Forest Park and McDonough and out past the airport. The ones her father bragged about at every dinner. The ones that had nearly gone under in 2019 when a contract with a regional grocery chain collapsed, and the family had quietly scrambled to refinance $3.2 million in commercial debt. He had bought that debt. Not in his name. Through Cresthill. Through a chain of holding companies designed by a banking attorney in Wilmington, so that no one looking at the warehouse paperwork would ever connect it to a black man in dented boots married to their daughter. He had bought it as a favor. Vivienne had asked him, 3 years into their marriage, if he had any way to help her father quietly, because the family pride could not survive a public bankruptcy. He had said yes. He had not told her how. He had structured it as a slow conversion. The Beaumonts had been paying interest to a holding company they believed was a private equity fund in North Carolina. They had been paying him. For 6 years. He owned 78% of Beaumont Logistics outright through the debt-to-equity conversion clause he had inserted into the original agreement, a clause her father's lawyer had glossed over because the interest rate had been so favorable he had not bothered to read past the second page. Marcus had been waiting. Not for this. Just waiting, the way his grandmother had taught him to wait, because he had always known that men who toasted dead weight eventually had to settle the bill. He went to bed in the guest room. Vivienne came home at midnight and did not check on him. The next morning he met Felicia Green at her office on the 17th floor of a building downtown with windows that faced east toward the rising sun. Felicia was 61, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and she had been his attorney for 12 years. She read through the forged refinance document and the bank records and the transfer trail to Bryony and Pierce. She did not flinch. She set the papers down and looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Marcus," she said, "you have a forgery on a federally regulated mortgage instrument. You have wire fraud across state lines through Pierce's Florida LLC. You have a conspiracy that involves at least 3 Beaumonts and their family attorney. And you have a wife who filed for divorce on the assumption that you would never look closely enough to see any of it. We are not just defending you in a divorce. We are going to detonate them legally, and we are going to do it within the bounds of the law, and we are going to do it so cleanly that none of them will ever recover." He nodded once. He thanked her. He drove from her office to a diner in Decatur, where his uncle Jerome was waiting for him in a back booth. Jerome was 74 and had been a federal investigator for 30 years before retiring to fish and read history books. He was the only family Marcus had left who remembered his grandmother as a young woman. Jerome listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Jerome stirred his coffee and said, "Your grandmother told me something once, the year your father closed the shop. She said the worst people in the world are not the cruel ones. They are the ones who underestimate quiet men. Cruel men you can see coming. The underestimators walk right into their own ruin smiling." Jerome reached across the table and put his hand on Marcus's wrist. "You are not their victim, son. You are their landlord. Don't ever forget that." Marcus drove home that afternoon with the words landlord and underestimator turning in his chest like keys finding their locks. By the time he reached his street, he had a plan. 3 days passed. Felicia filed nothing. Marcus said nothing to Vivienne. He came home each evening and ate the dinners she put in front of him. He answered her small talk. He let her think he had not been at the compound that Sunday, because she had clearly decided to assume he had simply forgotten, and her family had clearly decided not to ask. He kissed her cheek twice in those 3 days. Each time her perfume was different from the perfume she had been wearing the year before. On the 4th day, Felicia called him with the audit report from the forensic accountant she had brought in. Bryony Beaumont had been laundering wedding deposits from her event planning business through a fake vendor account for 19 months. Pierce Beaumont had signed 3 fraudulent invoices on behalf of Beaumont Logistics in the last year alone, drawing operating capital out of warehouse accounts and into a personal trading account. Her father Vernon had signed off on 2 of those invoices without reading them. The family attorney Reginald Hadaway had notarized a power of attorney document for Vivienne 3 months ago that gave her authority over assets she did not legally have authority over, which under Georgia law was a violation that could cost him his license. Marcus listened to it all. When Felicia finished, he said one sentence. "Schedule the meeting at the warehouses. Friday morning. Bring everyone." Friday morning, the conference room on the 2nd floor of the Forest Park warehouse, the room where Vernon Beaumont had run his quarterly meetings for 19 years, sat full. Vernon at the head of the table in a navy blazer. Lenora beside him. Vivienne in a cream suit she had clearly chosen to project confidence. Bryony to her right. Pierce across from her. Reginald Hadaway at the far end with a leather portfolio. They had been told by Felicia's office that a representative of Crest Hill Holdings, the firm holding the warehouse debt, had requested a meeting to discuss a restructuring. They had assumed it was a routine quarterly review. Vernon had assumed he could charm whoever walked in. The door opened. Marcus walked in wearing the same Carhartt and the same dented boots. Felicia followed him with a file box. Behind her came the forensic accountant. Behind him came a representative from the bank that had originated the refinance document Vivienne had forged. The Beaumonts stared. Vernon half rose from his chair. "Marcus, son, what are you doing here? This is a business meeting." Marcus sat down at the foot of the table opposite Vernon. He did not answer. Felicia opened the file box. She laid out the documents one at a time, in order. The original 2019 debt agreement between Beaumont Logistics and Crest Hill Holdings, LLC. The debt-to-equity conversion clause, highlighted in yellow. the chain of ownership that traced Cresthill back through 3 holding companies to the trust in Marcus's name. The forensic audit of Brani's vendor fraud. Pierce's 3 fraudulent invoices. Reginald's improperly notarized power of attorney. The forged refinance document with Marcus's notarized signature exemplar laid beside it for comparison. The bank statements showing $84,000 to Brani and $62,000 to Pierce. The retainer agreement Vivienne had signed with the divorce attorney 14 months earlier. Lenora's face moved through 3 colors in 8 seconds. Vivienne reached for her purse and then set it down because there was nowhere to go with it. Marcus spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet. He did not look at Vivienne. He looked at Vernon. "Mr. Beaumont, I bought your debt in 2019 as a favor to your daughter, who told me your family pride could not survive a public bankruptcy. I have been the silent landlord of this company for 6 years. As of this morning, exercising the conversion clause you signed without reading, I own 78% of Beaumont Logistics. The board meeting to ratify the conversion was held yesterday. The new ownership has been filed with the Secretary of State of Georgia. You are no longer the majority owner of this business. You are an employee if I choose to keep you." Vernon's mouth opened. No sound came. Marcus shifted his gaze to Reginald Hadaway. "Mr. Hadaway, the State Bar has been notified of your involvement in the notarization of a power of attorney that conveyed authority Mrs. Whitfield did not possess. You will be hearing from them within the week." He shifted to Brani. "Your event planning business has been referred to the ears for the vendor fraud. Pierce, the fraudulent invoices have been turned over to federal prosecutors. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia has been briefed." He looked, finally, at Vivienne. "You forged a federally regulated mortgage document. That is a felony. My attorney has prepared a settlement offer that will allow you to avoid prosecution if you sign it within 48 hours. The terms are not generous. They were not meant to be." Vivienne's voice came out thin. "Marcus, please, we can talk about this. I never meant—" Lenora cut her off with a single sharp word. "Stop." Lenora was looking at her daughter the way a woman looks at a stranger who has just broken her favorite vase. "Stop talking, Vivienne, stop." Marcus stood up. He gathered nothing because he had brought nothing. He walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned halfway back. "Your mother once called me dead weight at a party I was not invited to. I want you to remember something. Dead weight doesn't move. It anchors. I have been the anchor under everything you stood on for 6 years. You toasted the wrong man." He walked out. The room behind him was silent. He did not look back. 8 months later, the morning light came through the windows of a renovated Craftsman in Grant Park that Marcus had bought the previous spring and rebuilt himself with 2 of his most trusted framers. The floors were rift-sawn white oak he had laid in a chevron pattern across the main room. The kitchen counters were soapstone. There was a small back garden where he had planted a Japanese maple and 2 raised beds of tomatoes that had begun to split at the seams under their own weight. He stood at the counter pouring coffee into the same chipped Whitfield & Sons mug. The credenza from the old house sat against the dining room wall. He had refused to leave it behind. Renee, the architect he had begun seeing 4 months earlier, came in from the back porch with the newspaper tucked under her arm. She was 41, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who asked questions and listened to the answers. She did not perform. She poured her own coffee and kissed the side of his face and went back to the porch to keep reading. Whitfield Build Group had expanded. The Inman Park development had sold out before the framing was finished. He had signed a contract for a $14 million mixed-use project in Cabbagetown and had hired 4 new project managers, 2 of them young black men he had pulled out of a trade school in Lithonia and put on real salaries with real benefits. He had started a foundation in his grandmother's name that paid for tools and apprenticeships for kids out of the Atlanta public school system. Beaumont Logistics was now Whitfield Logistics. He had kept the warehouses and the workers and let the workers know that nothing would change for them. He had let Vernon go in the 2nd month, quietly. With a small severance Vernon had not earned and did not deserve, but that Marcus had paid out anyway, because his grandmother had told him once that you did not measure your character by how you treated people who could hurt you. Vivienne had signed the settlement. She had avoided prosecution. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brookhaven and worked as a junior associate at a marketing agency where her old name carried no weight. Briani had pled out on the tax charges and was on probation. Pierce was awaiting trial. Reginald Hadaway had surrendered his law license. Lenora had stopped speaking to her daughter entirely, which was the cruelty Vivienne had not seen coming and could not survive. Marcus heard about all of it secondhand, through Felicia, through a former mutual friend, through the brief letter Lenora had sent him in the 7th month asking if he would be willing to meet for coffee. He had declined politely. He carried his coffee to the back porch and sat down beside Renee. The Japanese maple moved slightly in the morning air. The tomatoes leaned heavy on their cages. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked the way clocks did in houses that belonged to men who had finally stopped waiting. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about her napkin and her herringbone pattern and the words she had said to him at 22 that he had not understood until he was 39. He thought about what it meant to be the anchor. He drank his coffee. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. Some men spent their whole lives trying to be seen. The wise ones learned, eventually, that the men worth seeing were the ones who had never needed the room to notice them at all. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.